Leah Marshall was running late again. As she pulled up in front of the New Orleans courthouse, she glanced at the clock on the dashboard of her sedan. 10 minutes until the trial started. Her heart pounded a little faster. This was the day she had been dreading, yet had prepared for meticulously. Today was the opening day of a high-profile case that could change the way racial profiling was handled in Louisiana forever. Stepping out of her car, Leah took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. As an accomplished black judge, she had navigated her fair share of adversity in the legal world, but the weight of this particular case hit differently. It wasn't just a case to her, it was personal. The defendant, a young black man named Kevin Daniels, had been arrested in his own neighborhood without cause. The officer who had detained him claimed he fit the description of someone involved in suspicious activity. It sounded familiar, too familiar. Leah strode across the parking lot, her heels clicking rhythmically on the pavement. Instead of using the grand entrance, she opted for a side door. Today, the main steps of the courthouse were swarmed with reporters, their cameras poised and ready for the story of the day. She didn't have time for the media frenzy. As she approached the side door, she noticed a young white police officer standing guard. His stance was rigid, and his eyes followed her closely as she came nearer. Leah reached for the ID badge hanging from her neck, her usual routine before entering the building. But before she could even present it, the officer blocked her path. "Ma'am, I need to see some identification," he said, his tone sharp. Leah raised her eyebrows, taken aback. "I'm Judge Marshall," she said, lifting the badge higher for him to see. "I'm presiding over the Daniels case this morning." The officer didn't even glance at the badge. His eyes, cold and calculating, scanned her up and down. Leah felt the familiar burn of anger rise in her chest but kept her face calm. "There's been an incident nearby, and you match the description of someone involved. I'm going to need you to answer a few questions," he continued, his voice laced with suspicion. Leah stared at him for a long moment, trying to process what was happening. The irony was suffocating. Here she was, about to oversee a trial about racial profiling, and she was being racially profiled at the courthouse doors. "Officer," she said, her voice steady, though she could feel her pulse quickening. "I don't have time for this. The trial starts in less than 10 minutes, and I need to get inside." She held out her badge again, willing him to just take one look and recognize his mistake. But the officer wasn't budging. His hand hovered over his belt, close to the handcuffs clipped to his waist. "I don't care who you say you are, ma'am," he snapped, stepping closer. "You're going to need to come with me." Leah's breath hitched. This was escalating fast. She could see the look in his eyes, the kind of look she'd seen too many times growing up in the South. A mix of suspicion and contempt. It wasn't about her being a judge, it was about her being black. Before she could say anything else, another voice cut through the tension. "What's going on here?" Leah turned to see an older black officer approaching, his face a mix of surprise and concern. "Marshall." His eyes widened as he recognized her. "Judge Marshall?" "Yes," Leah replied, her voice tight. The older officer shot a glance at the younger one. "Stand down," he ordered, his voice firm. The younger officer, still fuming, took a reluctant step back. "She matches the description," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "That's the judge," the older officer snapped. "Do you want to lose your job?" The younger officer mumbled something under his breath, finally backing off completely. Leah forced herself to take a deep breath. She had to stay calm. Losing her temper now would only play into the hands of someone like this. "Are you all right, ma'am?" the older officer asked, his voice softening. Leah nodded, though her jaw was clenched. "I'm fine, thank you." Without another word, she turned and walked into the courthouse, her heart still racing. Inside, the familiar sterile halls welcomed her with the comfort of routine, but as she walked, the scene from outside replayed in her head on a loop. She had dealt with racism her entire life, but for it to happen like this on the day of this trial, it was almost too much. The courtroom quieted as Leah banged her gavel, calling the room to order. The trial began smoothly enough, with opening statements from both sides. But Leah's mind kept drifting back to the officer outside, his sneering face, the way he had judged her in an instant. It felt too close to the case she was now presiding over. Then came the first witness, Kevin Daniels himself. Leah leaned forward slightly as he took the stand. His testimony was raw and painful. He described being stopped by the police for simply walking in his own neighborhood. He hadn't done anything wrong, hadn't even been acting suspiciously, yet he was treated like a criminal, handcuffed and humiliated in front of his neighbors. Leah could feel the weight of his words as he spoke. She had heard stories like this before, countless times, but today it hit differently. It wasn't just about Kevin Daniels, it was about the countless others like him. And it was about her. Halfway through the testimony, the door at the back of the courtroom creaked open, and Leah's heart sank. The young officer from earlier, the one who had stopped her, walked into the room. He made his way to the witness stand, his face pale and tense. Leah's eyes followed him, every nerve in her body on edge. The prosecutor stood, addressing the court. "We would like to call Officer Bill Wilkins to the stand." Bill Wilkins. Leah hadn't even caught his name before. She watched as he took the stand, his movements stiff and awkward. She had to remind herself to remain impartial, to stay professional, but it was hard. This was the same man who had looked at her not as a judge, but as a suspect. Wilkins shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. The prosecutor began questioning him, asking him to describe his role in Kevin Daniels' arrest. "I was patrolling the neighborhood when I saw Daniels," Wilkins began, his voice lacking the confidence he had shown earlier. He looked out of place, like he didn't belong there." Leah's grip on her gavel tightened. Out of place. That phrase, she had heard it before, too many times. It was code for, he was black, and I didn't think he should be there. The prosecutor pressed on, his tone sharp. "What exactly made Mr. Daniels look out of place, Officer Wilkins?" Bill fidgeted in his seat. He was acting nervous, looking around. It seemed like he was up to something. Leah felt the anger rising in her again. She had reviewed the case file. Daniels had been waiting for his rideshare. There was no crime, no suspicious behavior, he had simply been a black man in the wrong place at the wrong time, in the eyes of the police. The prosecutor wasn't letting up. "Did you find anything on Mr. Daniels that suggested he had committed a crime, Officer Wilkins?" Bill hesitated, his face flushing. "No," he admitted. "We didn't." The room was silent for a moment. Leah could feel the tension building, thick and palpable. She glanced over at the jury, watching their reactions. Some were clearly moved, others seemed conflicted. But the truth was plain as day, Kevin Daniels had been arrested for nothing more than being black. Bill's testimony continued, his story unraveling with every question the prosecutor asked. Small inconsistencies began to appear, his version of events falling apart. Leah watched him closely, noticing how his eyes kept flickering toward her, filled with discomfort. He knew who she was now, and he knew exactly what he had done. When the prosecutor finally finished, Bill looked like a shell of the man who had tried to detain her outside the courthouse. Leah felt no pity for him, but she did feel the weight of what was happening. This wasn't just about one case, it was about a system that had allowed people like Bill to operate unchecked for too long. As the trial continued, Leah fought to keep her emotions in check. She had to remain neutral, had to ensure that justice was served. But it was hard, the parallels between her experience and the case in front of her were impossible to ignore. By the end of the day, the courtroom was buzzing with tension. The defense attorney made his closing statements, trying to paint Bill as a well-meaning officer who had made an honest mistake. But Leah knew better, and so did the prosecutor. Samantha Green, the prosecutor, rose for her final argument. She turned to the jury, her voice steady and powerful. "This case is not just about Kevin Daniels," she said. "It's about a pattern that we've seen too often in our justice system. It's about officers like Bill Wilkins, who see a young black man in a neighborhood and assume he must be up to no good. It's about how this assumption leads to wrongful arrests, to humiliation, to injustice. And it's time to say enough." The courtroom was silent as Samantha's words sank in. Leah could feel the shift in the room. The jury was listening, they understood. When the trial finally came to a close, Leah dismissed the courtroom for the day. But she remained seated for a moment longer, her mind racing. She had done her job, had presided over the case fairly, but the encounter outside the courthouse still gnawed at her. It was a reminder that no matter her position, no matter her accomplishments, she would always be seen through the lens of her race. Suddenly, the door to the courtroom opened, and Sergeant Michael Harris, the older officer who had intervened earlier, walked in. He approached the bench quietly, his face lined with concern. "Judge Marshall," he said softly. "Can I have a word?" Leah looked up, surprised. "Of course." Harris sighed, glancing around to make sure they were alone. "I wanted to talk to you about what happened earlier with Wilkins. He's not a bad kid, you know, but he's got blind spots, like a lot of them do." Leah met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "Blind spots," she repeated, her voice tinged with bitterness. "You mean racism?" Harris winced but didn't argue. "Maybe. Probably. But I want you to know I'm trying to fix it from the inside." Leah studied him for a long moment. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that real change was possible. But after everything she had seen, everything she had experienced, it was hard to hold on to that hope. "What do you suggest I do?" she asked quietly. "When I'm sitting up here day after day, hearing cases like this, knowing what I've experienced firsthand?" Harris was silent for a long time before finally answering. "You keep doing what you're doing, Judge. You keep holding people accountable. That's the only way things are going to change." Leah nodded slowly, though the weight of the responsibilities still pressed heavily on her shoulders. The trial wasn't over yet, and there would be more battles to fight. But for today, at least, she had taken a step forward. As Harris left the room, Leah glanced around the empty courtroom. She knew the fight was far from over. But today, justice had been served, and that, she thought, was a start. The following morning, the air inside the courthouse was thick with anticipation. The jury had been deliberating all night, and today would bring their decision. Leah Marshall sat in her chambers, trying to center herself for what would undoubtedly be a pivotal moment, not just in this case, but for many who had been watching closely. This trial was bigger than one man's wrongful arrest. It was about the fabric of justice and the biases sewn into it. Leah sipped her coffee, staring at the files spread across her desk. Outside, she could hear the muffled sounds of reporters and protesters gathering in front of the courthouse. This was more than a local story now. News outlets across the country had picked it up, and it had become a symbol for the systemic racism still plaguing law enforcement. Her mind wandered to the events of the previous day. Bill Wilkins, the officer who had profiled her, had sat in that courtroom, clearly shaken, realizing his testimony could tear apart the very system he was part of. For all the courtroom's weighty silence, Leah had heard the subtle cracks in his voice, seen the tension in his face. Bill wasn't an outlier, he was a product of a flawed institution. And Leah knew that this case was about more than just making an example of one officer, it was about pushing a conversation that America had been avoiding for too long. She had a duty to deliver justice in this one case, but the weight of responsibility she felt was crushing. This trial symbolized a broader issue, the need to reform a system that allowed bias and profiling to become standard practice. There was a knock on the door, snapping her back to reality. "Come in," Leah said, her voice steadier than she felt. Her clerk, Emily, entered, holding a folder. "The jury's ready," she said softly. Leah nodded, rising from her chair. She took a deep breath, smoothing her robe. "Let's do this." As she made her way to the courtroom, the sound of her footsteps echoed through the hallway. The courthouse felt different today. The tension wasn't just in the courtroom anymore, it was everywhere. Leah could feel it pressing in from all sides, an unspoken anxiety that everyone was carrying. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was stifling. Reporters filled the gallery, their pens poised, cameras ready. The families of both Kevin Daniels and Officer Wilkins were seated in the front rows, both groups tense and waiting. Leah took her place at the bench, glancing briefly at Kevin Daniels, who sat with his lawyer at the defense table. His face was somber, but there was a glint of hope in his eyes, a hope that justice would be served, that this trial might actually mean something. She shifted her gaze to Bill Wilkins. He looked far less sure of himself than the day before. His eyes darted nervously around the room, and for the first time since the trial began, he seemed small, like a man who had finally realized he couldn't outrun what he had done. Leah cleared her throat. "Please bring in the jury," she said, her voice echoing in the quiet room. The doors opened, and the 12 jurors filed in. Leah watched them carefully as they took their seats, trying to read their expressions, but their faces were unreadable, their eyes fixed straight ahead. The jury foreman, a middle-aged woman with dark hair pulled back into a tight bun, held a slip of paper in her hand, clutching it like a lifeline. Leah nodded toward her. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreman stood, her hands shaking slightly as she unfolded the piece of paper. "We have, Your Honor," she said, her voice trembling just enough to betray the gravity of the moment. "Please read the verdict," Leah instructed, her own heart pounding in her chest, though she kept her face composed. The foreman glanced down at the paper before looking up again, her voice firming. "In the case of Officer Bill Wilkins, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty of wrongful arrest and racial discrimination." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Leah glanced at Kevin Daniels, who sat frozen, his face blank for a moment before relief began to wash over him. His lawyer patted him on the back, and Kevin's eyes began to glisten, though he blinked away the tears. Leah then turned her gaze toward Bill Wilkins. He was staring straight ahead, his face pale, his hands clenched tightly together. The weight of the verdict had clearly hit him, and for a moment, it seemed as if he might break. She banged her gavel once. "Court is adjourned." As the room began to stir, with reporters scrambling for the exits and people filing out, Bill suddenly stood. "Your Honor," he said, his voice cracking. Leah paused, looking down at him. The courtroom quieted again, all eyes turning to the young officer. He was visibly shaking now, his face pale as he struggled to find the words. I need to say." He swallowed hard, and his gaze fell to the floor. "I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was protecting the community, but I was wrong." His voice wavered, thick with emotion. "I see now that I let my assumptions, my prejudices, cloud my judgment. And I'm sorry." The silence in the room was deafening. Leah felt her breath catch in her throat. It was an apology, yes, but it wasn't enough. It couldn't undo what had been done. She thought about all the time she had been in Kevin's shoes, stopped for nothing more than being black, and she knew this apology, though sincere, wouldn't erase those experiences. She met his eyes, her voice steady but firm. "Your apology is noted, Officer Wilkins. But the harm caused by your actions, by actions like yours, runs deep. It affects lives, families, and entire communities. Saying sorry doesn't fix that." Bill nodded, looking defeated. He didn't try to argue, didn't try to explain any further. He simply stood there, accepting the consequences of his actions. And for the first time, Leah saw a flicker of understanding in his eyes. The courtroom slowly began to empty, and Leah remained seated for a moment, watching as Kevin Daniels hugged his family, his face a mix of relief and exhaustion. Bill Wilkins stood quietly by the exit, waiting to be escorted out, the weight of his guilt heavy on his shoulders. Leah's mind was racing. She had done her job, upheld the law, and presided fairly over this case. But it wasn't enough. This trial was just one drop in a much larger ocean of injustice. For every Kevin Daniels who received a semblance of justice, there were countless others whose stories would never be heard, whose cases would never make it to a courtroom. Suddenly, the door to the courtroom opened again, and Sergeant Michael Harris walked in. Leah looked up, surprised to see him. He approached her quietly, his face a mix of concern and something else, something like hope. "Judge Marshall," he said softly. "Can I have a word?" Leah nodded, gesturing for him to sit. "Of course." Harris sat down, folding his hands in front of him. "I just wanted to say thank you." Leah raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "For handling this case the way you did," Harris replied. "For holding us accountable. We need that. The system needs that." Leah let out a long breath, leaning back in her chair. "I appreciate that, Sergeant. But it doesn't feel like enough. This was just one case. There are so many more out there, so many people who don't get justice. Harris nodded, his expression thoughtful. You're right. But that's why we have to keep pushing. It's not going to change overnight, but every step matters. Every case like this chips away at the bigger problem. Leah was silent for a moment, thinking about his words. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that change was possible. But after everything she had seen, it was hard to keep that hope alive. What about Wilkins? She asked quietly. What happens to officers like him, ones who've been taught to think a certain way? Harris sighed. I'm not gonna lie, it's hard. There are a lot of guys like him. But there are also people like me, trying to change things from the inside. And I'll keep doing that as long as I can. Leah looked at him, pausing for a moment before responding. You don't need to thank me, Kevin. I was just doing my job. Kevin shook his head. No. It's more than that. This trial, it wasn't just about me. It was about showing people what really happens out there, what we go through. You gave me a voice. Leah's chest tightened. She understood what he meant, and she nodded. I hope this is a step toward change, she said, her words carefully chosen. But it's just one case. We still have a long way to go. Kevin's eyes softened with understanding. I know. But it's a start. And for that, I'm grateful. Leah watched him leave, his attorney close behind, and she couldn't shake the feeling that there was so much more left to be done. One trial, one verdict, wasn't enough to dismantle a system that had been built over centuries. But she knew Kevin was right, it was a start. She sighed and began to make her way to her chambers, her footsteps slow and deliberate. The media had already swarmed the front entrance, so she opted to exit through the side door again, hoping to avoid the cameras and microphones that would inevitably be thrust in her face. But as soon as she pushed open the door, Leah found herself face to face with Officer Bill Wilkins. He was standing by the side of the building, leaning against the wall, his face drawn and pale. His uniform seemed too big for him now, as if the weight of the trial had shrunk him down. Leah stopped in her tracks, her heart thudding in her chest. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The tension between them was palpable, a mixture of guilt, anger, and confusion hanging in the air. Judge Marshall, Bill began, his voice hoarse. He straightened up, his eyes locking onto hers. I didn't expect to see you here. Leah remained silent, waiting for him to continue. She didn't know what he could possibly say that would change anything, but she allowed him the moment. I've been thinking, Bill said slowly, his words heavy, about everything, about what happened in there and about what I did to you. He paused, his hands fidgeting at his sides. I know saying sorry isn't enough. It won't fix what I did. But I need you to know, I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Leah's eyes narrowed. She had heard this before. She had heard variations of this apology countless times. You didn't mean for it to happen, she repeated, her voice cold. But it did happen, Officer Wilkins. And it keeps happening, to people like Kevin, to people like me. So forgive me if I'm not moved by your remorse right now. Bill winced, but he didn't back down. I know I screwed up. I know I let my biases take over. And I'm trying to understand that now. But it's not as simple as just unlearning everything overnight. I've been taught to see things a certain way, and I didn't question it until now. Leah crossed her arms, her face still stern. And what changed now? The fact that you got caught, or the fact that someone finally called you out on it? Bill looked down, his shoulders slumping. Both, he admitted. Getting caught made me realize how wrong I was. But seeing how my actions affected you, and Kevin, and everyone else in that courtroom, it hit me in a way I wasn't prepared for. He hesitated, then met her gaze again. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Judge Marshall. I want to do better. I need to do better. Leah studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. She could see the conflict in his eyes, the genuine struggle to reconcile his actions with the person he wanted to be. But she also knew that remorse wasn't enough. It was a start, but it wouldn't undo the harm he had caused. Officer Wilkins, she said finally, her voice measured, if you truly want to change, it's going to take more than words. It's going to take actions, consistent, intentional actions. And it's not going to be easy. Bill nodded, his jaw tightening with resolve. I know. And I'm ready for that. Leah exhaled slowly, her gaze softening just a fraction. Good. Then start by listening. Listen to the people you've wronged, to the communities you've hurt. Learn from them. And when you're ready to act, do so with humility and accountability. I will, Bill said quietly. Thank you for giving me the chance to say this. Leah gave a small nod, then stepped past him, her heels clicking against the pavement. She didn't look back. There was still too much work to be done, and she couldn't let herself get bogged down by one man's remorse. As she entered her chambers, Leah allowed herself a brief moment to reflect. The day had been long and emotionally exhausting, but she knew this was the reality of the fight for justice. It wasn't clean or easy. It was messy, slow, and full of setbacks. But it was worth it. The next morning, Leah awoke to the sound of her phone buzzing incessantly. She reached for it, squinting at the screen. Headlines from various news outlets filled her notifications, all centering on the trial and its outcome. The story had gone national, sparking debates about systemic racism and the need for police reform. Leah scrolled through the articles, her emotions a mix of pride and exhaustion. The trial had brought attention to an issue that desperately needed it, but she knew how quickly public focus could shift. The momentum needed to be maintained, and she wasn't sure how long she could keep fighting this battle on her own. Later that day, as she entered the courthouse, Leah was greeted by Emily, her clerk. Judge Marshall, Emily said, handing her a stack of papers. You've received dozens of letters, support, questions, people sharing their own stories. Leah looked at the pile, her heart heavy with both gratitude and sorrow. Each letter represented another person affected by the same issues she had spent her career addressing. Thank you, Emily, she said, her voice quiet. I'll go through them later. The day's docket was full, but Leah couldn't stop thinking about the trial and its aftermath. During a break, she sat in her chambers, opening one of the letters. It was from a young woman named Tasha, who shared a story eerily similar to Kevin's. She had been stopped and searched on her way home from work, humiliated in front of her neighbors. The officers had found nothing, of course, but the damage to her dignity and sense of safety was done. Leah closed her eyes, the weight of it all pressing down on her. These stories were not isolated incidents, they were part of a pattern, a system that had failed too many for too long. And yet, here she was, one judge in one courtroom, trying to push back against a tide that felt insurmountable. But as she sat there, another thought crept in. Every small victory mattered. Every case like Kevin's, every conversation sparked by the trial, every letter from someone who felt seen and heard, it all added up. Change wasn't a tidal wave, it was a series of ripples, each one building on the last. By the end of the day, Leah felt a renewed sense of determination. She might not be able to fix everything, but she could keep fighting. For Kevin, for Tasha, for herself, and for the countless others whose stories hadn't been told. As she left the courthouse that evening, Leah noticed a small group of protesters still gathered outside. They held signs calling for justice, accountability, and change. One of them, a young man, recognized her and stepped forward. Judge Marshall, he called out. Thank you for what you did. It means a lot. Leah paused, offering him a faint smile. Thank you, she said. But the work isn't done yet. He nodded, his expression serious. We know. That's why we're here. Leah walked to her car, the weight on her shoulders feeling just a little lighter. The road ahead was long, but she wasn't walking it alone. As Leah drove home, the city lights reflected in her rearview mirror, a stark reminder of the duality she faced daily. New Orleans was vibrant, alive with culture and history, but it was also a city grappling with deep-seated systemic inequities. The courthouse she had just left, while a symbol of justice, often felt like a battleground where fairness was fought for, not guaranteed. The streets were quieter now, the hum of the day winding down. Leah replayed the events of the past week in her mind, the trial, the verdict, and the moments that lingered most painfully, like her encounter with Officer Wilkins. She wondered how many more people out there were carrying the same wounds as Kevin Daniels, wounds inflicted by a system that promised protection but often delivered harm. At home, Leah sank into her couch, the tension in her body slowly easing. She reached for the letters Emily had handed her earlier, pulling out another one at random. This one was from an older man, James, who had grown up during the civil rights movement. He wrote about his own experiences with police harassment, about the fear and anger that had shaped his youth. But he also wrote about hope, about seeing the changes that people like Leah were working toward. "You remind me of what we fought for back then," he wrote. "Keep going. We need people like you to carry the torch." Leah set the letter down, her eyes misting. It was a poignant reminder of the larger picture, of the generations that had come before her and the responsibility she felt to honor their struggles. She thought about her grandmother, a woman who had marched and protested, who had taught Leah that justice wasn't something given, it was something demanded. The next day, Leah returned to the courthouse with a renewed sense of purpose. Her docket was full again, but she approached each case with the same unwavering commitment to fairness. Between hearings, she met with a local advocacy group that had requested her guidance on an initiative to address racial bias in the justice system. It wasn't part of her job description, but Leah knew it was part of her duty. The group, a mix of community leaders, lawyers, and activists, shared their ideas with Leah. They discussed everything from police training programs to changes in legislation. As they talked, Leah felt a sense of camaraderie, of shared purpose. She wasn't fighting this battle alone. There were others just as committed, just as determined. One of the activists, a young woman named Maya, spoke passionately about the need for accountability in law enforcement. "We can't keep letting officers like Wilkins off the hook," she said. "There has to be real consequences, or nothing will change." Leah nodded, understanding her frustration. "Accountability is crucial," she agreed. "But so is education. If we don't address the root causes of these biases, we'll keep seeing the same patterns repeat." Maya hesitated, then sighed. "You're right. But it's hard not to feel like we're shouting into the void sometimes." Leah gave her a reassuring smile. "Every shout echoes. And those echoes grow louder with time." After the meeting, Leah returned to her chambers, her mind buzzing with ideas. She began drafting a plan to host workshops at the courthouse, inviting officers, lawyers, and community members to engage in honest conversations about bias and justice. It was a small step, but one she hoped would create ripples. Later that week, Leah received an unexpected visitor, Sergeant Michael Harris. He stepped into her chambers, his expression a mix of weariness and determination. "Judge Marshall," he began, "I wanted to give you an update on Wilkins." Leah gestured for him to sit. "Go ahead." Harris settled into the chair across from her. "He's taking the verdict hard. But it's making him reflect, which is more than I can say for a lot of folks in his position. He's asked to be reassigned to a precinct where he can work on community outreach. He says he wants to learn." Leah raised an eyebrow, her skepticism evident. "And do you think he's sincere?" Harris hesitated. "I think he's trying. And I think that's worth something. But only time will tell if he follows through." Leah nodded thoughtfully. "If he's serious about change, he'll have to prove it, not just to me, but to the community he's hurt." Harris leaned forward, his voice earnest. "I know it's not enough. But it's a start. And I wanted you to know that your actions, this trial, they're making a difference. Even if it's just one person at a time." Leah appreciated his words, though she knew the path ahead was still fraught with challenges. Change was slow, incremental, and often met with resistance. But moments like these reminded her that progress, however small, was still progress. As Harris left, Leah glanced at her calendar. The weeks ahead were packed with cases, meetings, and community events. It was overwhelming, but it also filled her with a sense of purpose. She wasn't just a judge, she was an advocate, a leader, and a voice for those who had been silenced. That evening, as she prepared for bed, Leah reflected on the letters, the trial, and the conversations she had shared over the past few days. The work was far from over, but she felt a renewed sense of hope. Piece by piece, step by step, she would continue to fight for a justice system that truly served everyone. And as she turned off the light, Leah thought of Kevin Daniels and the countless others like him. Their stories fueled her resolve, reminding her why she had chosen this path in the first place. The road was long, but Leah was ready to keep walking. The next few months brought a whirlwind of activity for Leah Marshall. The ripple effects of the trial were evident everywhere, from the packed community forums she helped organize to the growing number of letters arriving at her chambers. The trial had sparked a dialogue, one that was long overdue. Leah found herself at the center of this conversation, balancing her duties as a judge with her newfound role as a symbol of justice and reform. While she was humbled by the recognition, she also felt the weight of the expectations placed upon her. People looked to her not only to preside over cases but to lead change in a system that often felt unyielding. One evening, as Leah was leaving the courthouse, she spotted a familiar figure waiting near the side entrance. It was Kevin Daniels. He looked more relaxed than she had ever seen him, dressed in casual clothes, a small smile on his face. "Kevin," Leah said, surprised. "What brings you here?" "I just wanted to stop by and thank you again," he replied. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since the trial, and I realized how much your words and your actions meant to me." Leah tilted her head, studying him. "How are you holding up?" "I'm doing better," Kevin admitted. "It's been a process, but I've started therapy, and I'm getting involved in community work. I want to make sure what happened to me doesn't happen to someone else." Leah smiled, a warmth spreading through her chest. "That's good to hear. Your story has already made an impact, Kevin. And what you're doing now will only add to that." Kevin hesitated for a moment, then added, "I've been speaking at schools, talking to young kids about their rights and about staying resilient. It feels good to turn something so painful into something meaningful." Leah nodded, her respect for him deepening. "You're making a difference, Kevin. And that's not easy. I'm proud of you." He smiled again, a hint of shyness in his expression. "Thank you, Judge Marshall. That means a lot." As Kevin walked away, Leah felt a renewed sense of purpose. His resilience reminded her why she continued to fight, even when the challenges felt insurmountable. Change wasn't just about courtroom decisions, it was about empowering people to rewrite their own narratives. The next day, Leah received a call from an unexpected source, Bill Wilkins. She hadn't spoken to the former officer since the trial, and his name appearing on her caller ID gave her pause. After a moment's hesitation, she answered. "Judge Marshall," Bill's voice came through the line, steady but hesitant. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all," Leah replied, her tone neutral. "What can I do for you, Officer Wilkins?" There was a brief silence before he corrected her. "Former officer, actually. I resigned from the force last week." Leah blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "I wasn't aware. May I ask why?" "I realized I couldn't do the job the way I had been doing it," Bill admitted. "The trial opened my eyes to a lot of things I didn't want to see before. I've been taking time to reflect, and I decided that if I couldn't be part of the solution within the system, I needed to find another way to make a difference." Leah listened intently, her initial skepticism giving way to curiosity. "And what's next for you?" "I'm not entirely sure yet," Bill said. "But I've started volunteering at a local community center. They work with at-risk youth, and I thought maybe I could help in some way. It's not much, but it feels like a start." Leah was silent for a moment, considering his words. While she still harbored doubts about the depth of his transformation, she also recognized the courage it took to leave the only career he had known. "Change isn't easy," Leah said finally. "But if you're committed to it, that's what matters. Keep listening, keep learning, and let your actions speak louder than your words." "Thank you, Judge Marshall," Bill said quietly. "I'll do my best." After the call ended, Leah sat back in her chair, her thoughts swirling. Bill's journey was far from over, but his willingness to confront his own biases and take responsibility for his actions was a step in the right direction. It was a reminder that change could happen even in the most unlikely places. In the weeks that followed, Leah continued her work, both in and out of the courtroom. She collaborated with local organizations to host workshops on implicit bias and systemic inequality. She met with lawmakers to advocate for policy reforms that would address the root causes of injustice. And she kept presiding over cases, each one a microcosm of the broader fight for equity. Despite the progress, there were still days when the weight of it all felt overwhelming. Leah often found herself questioning whether her efforts were enough, whether real change was possible within a system so deeply entrenched in its ways. But on those days, she thought of Kevin Daniels, of the letters from people like Tasha and James, of the protesters who had stood outside the courthouse even after the trial was over. Their voices, their stories, their hope, they were the fuel that kept her going. One evening, as Leah walked to her car, she noticed a mural being painted on the side of a nearby building. It depicted a diverse group of people standing together, their faces resolute, their hands linked. At the center was a quote that struck Leah to her core, *, "Justice is not a destination, it is a journey." *. She paused, taking in the image, her heart swelling with a mix of emotions. The fight for justice was far from over, but it was a fight worth continuing. And Leah Marshall was ready to keep walking the path, one step at a time. Months turned into a year, and the ripple effects of the trial were still being felt. Leah Marshall became a name synonymous with courage and fairness, but she resisted the urge to let the spotlight define her. She knew her work was just a fragment of a much larger battle, and staying grounded in her purpose was essential. One day, as Leah prepared for another packed schedule, she received an invitation to speak at a national justice reform summit. Leaders from across the country, judges, lawmakers, activists, and community leaders would be gathering to discuss actionable steps toward dismantling systemic inequities. The invitation felt both humbling and daunting, but Leah knew she couldn't turn it down. This was an opportunity to amplify the stories that had fueled her own journey. When she arrived at the summit, the energy in the room was electric. Discussions buzzed around ideas for policing reform, judicial accountability, and restorative justice. Leah took a seat on a panel alongside other trailblazers in the field, and as the moderator introduced her, she felt the weight of the moment settle on her shoulders. Judge Leah Marshall, the moderator began, has become a powerful voice for justice reform, particularly in addressing racial profiling and bias within our system. Judge Marshall, can you share how your experiences have shaped your perspective on the work that still needs to be done? Leah leaned into the microphone, her voice steady yet reflective. My experiences as a judge, and as a Black woman, have given me a unique lens through which I view justice, she said. The trial of Kevin Daniels was a pivotal moment, not just for the defendant, but for all of us. It forced us to confront uncomfortable truths about the assumptions we make and the systems we uphold. That trial was not an end, it was a beginning. And the work that lies ahead is about dismantling structures that perpetuate injustice while building systems rooted in equity and empathy. The room was silent, her words hanging in the air. She continued, we can't talk about reform without acknowledging the deep scars left by systemic racism. But acknowledgement alone is not enough. We must act. And that action starts with accountability at every level, from law enforcement to the judiciary to lawmakers. It's about creating spaces where every voice is heard, every story matters, and every person is treated with dignity. The applause that followed was both affirming and sobering. Leah knew that words could inspire, but they needed to be followed by tangible change. After the panel, attendees approached Leah, sharing their own struggles and triumphs in the fight for justice. Among them was a young law student named Amina, who spoke passionately about her desire to become a public defender. I want to fight for people like Kevin Daniels, Amina said, her eyes bright with determination. I've seen too many of my friends and family members get caught up in a system that doesn't care about them. Leah smiled warmly. We need people like you, Amina. Stay focused on your goals, and don't let the setbacks discourage you. This work is hard, but it's worth every effort. As the summit concluded, Leah returned home feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The connections she had made and the ideas that had been shared filled her with hope. But the summit also reminded her that the road to justice was long and winding, and the victories, while meaningful, were often incremental. Back at the courthouse, Leah threw herself into her work with even greater resolve. She presided over cases with the same meticulous care, ensuring that every defendant received a fair trial. She continued to push for educational initiatives, bringing workshops and discussions into the courthouse to foster understanding and empathy among legal professionals. One afternoon, as Leah reviewed a particularly troubling case involving a young man who had been wrongfully accused, her clerk, Emily, entered with a file. "Judge Marshall," Emily said, "you've been asked to participate in a pilot program. It's called the Community Justice Initiative." Leah raised an eyebrow. "What does it entail?" Emily explained, "It's a collaborative effort between judges, law enforcement, and community leaders to address systemic issues at the local level. The goal is to create alternative pathways to justice, diversion programs, restorative justice circles, and initiatives aimed at preventing wrongful arrests." Leah's interest was piqued. "It sounds ambitious. Who's leading it?" "A mix of people," Emily replied. "But they specifically asked for you to be involved because of your work on the Daniels trial." Leah nodded slowly. "Let's do it. Send me the details." The program became another cornerstone of Leah's work, and over time, it began to yield results. Community members who had long felt marginalized began to see themselves as active participants in shaping justice. Leah attended the circles herself, listening to the stories of those who had been impacted by the system and working alongside them to find solutions. One evening, during a particularly emotional restorative justice circle, Leah encountered Tasha, the young woman who had written her the letter months earlier. Tasha's story had stayed with Leah, and seeing her in person was a poignant moment. "You're the reason I'm here," Tasha told Leah, tears glistening in her eyes. "You gave me the courage to speak up, to believe that my voice matters." Leah felt her throat tighten. "You've always mattered, Tasha. Your story, your strength, it's what keeps me going." As the circle ended, Leah left with a profound sense of connection to the community she served. These moments reminded her that the fight for justice was not just about systems or policies, it was about people. It was about their lives, their dignity, and their futures. The years passed, and Leah's work continued to evolve. She became a mentor to young lawyers and judges, sharing her experiences and guiding them toward a more compassionate approach to justice. She also remained a tireless advocate for reform, speaking at conferences, meeting with lawmakers, and pushing for changes that would address the root causes of inequality. Leah's journey was far from over, but she took solace in the progress she had made and the lives she had touched. The fight for justice was a never-ending one, but it was a fight she was proud to be part of. As she stood in her chambers one evening, looking out over the city, Leah felt a quiet determination settle over her. The road ahead was long, but she was ready. Piece by piece, step by step, she would continue to build a system where justice truly meant justice for everyone. The Community Justice Initiative became a model for other cities across the country. It brought together people from all walks of life: activists, judges, educators, and law enforcement, committed to addressing systemic failures. Leah Marshall's role as a central figure in the program grew, not because she sought the spotlight, but because of her genuine dedication and tireless advocacy. The program's successes were many. Recidivism rates began to drop as diversion programs provided alternatives to incarceration. Young people who might have otherwise been lost in the system were given opportunities to grow, learn, and contribute to their communities. And most importantly, trust between marginalized communities and the justice system began to rebuild, slowly but surely. One evening, Leah attended a town hall meeting to discuss the progress of the initiative. The room was packed, and the energy was a mix of hope and skepticism. Leah sat among a panel of community leaders, ready to address questions and concerns. A man in the audience stood to speak. He was older, his face lined with years of struggle. "Judge Marshall," he began, his voice steady but heavy with emotion, "I've lived in this city my whole life. I've seen the system fail people like me over and over. What makes this program any different? Why should we believe things will change this time?" Leah leaned forward, meeting his gaze. "Your skepticism is valid," she said, her tone empathetic. "The system has failed you, and it's failed many others. I won't stand here and promise that this initiative will fix everything overnight, it won't. But it's a step. And it's different because it's built on listening, on partnership, and on holding ourselves accountable. Change is slow, but it's possible when we work together. The man nodded, his expression softening slightly. I just want to see my grandson grow up without having to fight the same battles I did. Leah's heart ached at his words. That's what we're working toward, she said. A future where every child can grow up with the same opportunities, the same dignity, and the same protection under the law. After the meeting, people approached Leah with questions, concerns, and stories. One young woman, holding a toddler on her hip, introduced herself as Jasmine. Judge Marshall, she said, I just wanted to thank you. My brother was one of the first people in the diversion program. He's doing so much better now, he's working, staying out of trouble. You gave him a chance, and it's changed his life. Leah smiled, moved by her words. Thank you for sharing that, Jasmine. Your brother did the hard work, I'm just glad we could give him the opportunity. As the town hall ended and the crowd began to disperse, Leah felt a renewed sense of purpose. These moments reminded her why she fought so hard, why she pushed through the exhaustion, the setbacks, and the resistance. Back at the courthouse, Leah continued to balance her caseload with her work in the community. She remained committed to mentoring young legal professionals, often inviting law students to observe her courtroom and engage in discussions about justice and reform. One afternoon, a law student named David approached her after a particularly challenging case. He was interning with a public defender's office and had been observing the trial. Judge Marshall, he said, can I ask you something? Of course, Leah replied, setting aside her notes. How do you stay hopeful? He asked, his voice tinged with frustration. I see so much injustice, so many obstacles. It feels like no matter what we do, the system doesn't change. Leah considered his question carefully before answering. Hope isn't always easy, she admitted. There are days when it feels like the weight of it all is too much. But I remind myself of the small victories, the lives we've been able to impact, the progress we've made. Change is slow, David. It's like planting seeds. You may not see the tree grow in your lifetime, but you keep planting because the future depends on it. David nodded, her words sinking in. Thank you, he said. That helps. Leah watched him leave, reflecting on her own journey. She had faced her share of doubts and frustrations, but she had also witnessed the power of persistence and community. The work was never-ending, but it was meaningful. One day, Leah received an email that brought everything full circle. It was from Kevin Daniels. In the years since his trial, Kevin had become a vocal advocate for criminal justice reform. He had started a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting young people in marginalized communities, helping them navigate a system that was often stacked against them. Judge Marshall, Kevin wrote, I wanted to thank you again for what you did for me. Your courage and fairness gave me a second chance, and I've made it my mission to pay it forward. I hope I'm making you proud. Leah's chest tightened as she read his words. She replied immediately. Kevin, you've always made me proud. The work you're doing is incredible, and it's exactly the kind of change we need. Keep going, you're inspiring more people than you know. As Leah sat back in her chair, she allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. The path she had walked was not an easy one, but it had been worth every step. She thought of Kevin, of Jasmine's brother, of the countless others whose lives had intersected with hers. Each one was a testament to the power of resilience and the importance of fighting for justice. Leah knew there was still so much work to be done, but she also knew she wasn't alone. Piece by piece, step by step, they were building something better, a system rooted in fairness, empathy, and accountability. As she looked out the window at the bustling city below, Leah felt a quiet determination. The fight for justice was far from over, but she was ready to keep going. And so, she did.